They made her scrub the gym floor with a toothbrush while the rest of the class stood laughing, not because she'd broken a rule, but because of the color of her skin. She didn't cry, didn't fight, didn't speak. She just did it, on her knees, humiliated in silence, while cameras didn't roll and teachers turned their backs. No one asked her name. No one cared where she came from. To them, she was just another outsider in a school that treated difference like a flaw. They thought she was quiet because she was weak. They thought her stillness meant surrender. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't see through the layers of cruelty and prejudice, was that beneath her silence was something stronger than fear, something waiting. What happens when the target stops flinching? What happens when the one pushed down refuses to stay there? This story isn't about revenge. It's about revelation. And trust me, by the time the truth comes out, everything they thought they knew about her will collapse. If this pulled you in, like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Tell me where you're watching from and what twist you saw coming, or didn't. I want to hear your thoughts. The sky was still gray when Taylor Monroe stepped out of the back seat of the cab, her feet landing on the damp pavement in front of Eldridge Academy. A heavy mist hung in the air, clinging to the brick walls and curling between the stone gargoyles perched above the iron gate. She looked up at the building, tall, cold, old, and for a moment she stood there in silence, as if her body understood something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then, without hesitation, she adjusted the crooked strap of her second-hand backpack and moved forward, her shoes thudding on the sidewalk, slightly offbeat and too loud. No one greeted her at the gate. No one stood with a clipboard or a welcome packet. Just a single security guard inside the booth who glanced up, barely registering her presence before lifting his hand in a mechanical wave. Inside the reception lobby, she stood alone near the check-in desk while clusters of students milled around, laughing, hugging, slapping high fives like they'd never spent a day apart. Taylor kept her eyes on the plaque above the main entrance, Eldridge Academy for Leadership and Advancement. Below, it hung portraits of former students, all framed in thick gold, every one of them polished and staring forward, bright-eyed and pale. A woman behind the front desk finally noticed her and offered a distracted smile before sliding over a paper schedule and a folded map without a single word. The secretary's attention immediately shifted to a white student behind her, one of the board members' sons. By the sound of the name, she whispered with enthusiasm. Taylor's blazer was too stiff. The tag itched the side of her neck, and the shoulder seams hung down an inch past where they should have ended. The skirt fell below her knees, not the hemline others wore. Her shoes were polished but old, the kind with creased leather and a worn sole that clicked too sharply on the floors as she moved down the hallway. She passed her first group of students, 4 girls in matching headbands, all glossy-haired, all whispering with their backs perfectly straight. One of them turned slightly, just enough to look Taylor up and down before nudging the girl beside her. There was no smile, just a shared glance, a mutual agreement that she didn't belong. First period was literature. Room 204. She entered the classroom 5 minutes early, hoping to settle in before the others arrived. She chose a seat in the second row, not in the front where she'd stand out, not in the back where she'd seem like she was hiding. She set her books on the desk, opened her notebook, and waited. The teacher entered first, tall and thin, with a beige cardigan and horn-rimmed glasses. She glanced at Taylor, offered a nod, and began writing on the board. Students filed in slowly. None sat beside her. The seats filled, every one of them, except the one directly next to hers. The girl who approached it hesitated, glanced at Taylor, then took a different chair. No one said a word. The lesson began. The topic, colonial literature. The teacher read a passage aloud about identity, about displacement. When she reached the line that described the native people as other, she paused briefly, as if reconsidering whether to say it, then read on. Taylor looked around. A few heads turned toward her for a moment, just long enough to be felt, but not long enough to be challenged. When the teacher began asking questions, hands shot up. Taylor raised hers too. The teacher scanned the room, glanced over her, and picked someone else. It happened again, then again. By the end of the class, Taylor hadn't spoken a word. Lunch was worse. The cafeteria echoed with laughter, sneakers squeaking against tile, and trays slamming against metal counters. Taylor stood near the entrance, holding a plastic tray with a sandwich and water, unsure where to sit. Every table had its silent territory. She spotted a long bench near the back, mostly empty. She sat quietly at the edge, facing the wall. Her tray steamed slightly, her hands resting neatly on either side. She hadn't even taken a bite when a loud burst of laughter exploded behind her. A moment later, a small paper cup of cranberry juice slid down the table toward her tray and stopped inches from her sleeve. She turned. The girl 2 tables over raised her eyebrows and gave a tight-lipped grin. No one said anything. Taylor picked up a napkin and wiped the juice off the table. Her appetite disappeared. Next was biology. The lab was cold and smelled like bleach and pencils. Each student had a designated partner for the semester. Hers was a boy named Paxton, who was already seated when she arrived. He didn't look up when she sat down. When the teacher passed out the day's assignment, Paxton pulled the worksheet toward him and began filling it out. She waited a moment, then leaned in slightly and offered to help. He didn't respond. She tried again. He slid the paper closer to himself without a glance. The rest of the class paired off, talking, sharing jokes, making diagrams together. Taylor sat still, watching her partner complete the assignment without her. The teacher passed their table once, looked down, said nothing, and moved on. After school, she returned her books to her locker, a narrow one near the bottom row, placed inconveniently between a wall and a recycling bin. When she pulled it open, a note fluttered out. It had been taped to the inside of the door. The handwriting was neat, cursive, almost elegant. The note read, "Don't smile too much. It makes people nervous." There was no name, no signature. She folded it once, slid it into her pocket, and closed the locker slowly. Walking out of the building, she passed the student council table setting up for the next day's club fair. One of the girls standing behind the table saw her and leaned over to whisper something to a boy beside her. They both laughed, not loudly, not rudely, just audibly enough for Taylor to know it was about her. Their eyes didn't leave her until she walked through the main doors. But the silence that surrounded her wasn't passive. It was crafted. That second week, subtle changes began to unfold, deliberate acts dressed in coincidence. In the hallway outside her third period class, the student bulletin board had been rearranged overnight. The club photos, academic awards, and sports team snapshots had all been updated. In the bottom corner, where the new student feature was typically placed, her photo had been included, taken during her first day, without her knowledge. The picture was unflattering, poorly lit, her eyes half closed, her expression neutral and unreadable. Beneath it, the caption read, "Taylor Monroe, quiet but curious." Someone had crossed out the word curious and replaced it in red pen with questionable. When she saw it, she paused for a moment, blinked twice, and moved on. She didn't touch it. She didn't report it. She didn't even frown. But the feeling followed her like smoke. That same day, she found a tiny envelope tucked into her locker vents. No name, no return address. Inside was a single folded note on thick, perfumed stationery. The handwriting was elegant again, but the message shorter this time. It read, "You're not being ignored, you're being measured." She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it wasn't kind. Her hands trembled just enough to smudge the ink as she folded it shut. In gym class, the girls' locker room smelled like hairspray and deodorant and lavender lotion, but beneath that, it carried a sharpness Taylor couldn't name. She changed in the far corner, always last, always facing the wall. On that Thursday, her gym shirt went missing from her locker. In its place was a much smaller one, stretched at the collar and stained at the hem. She wore it anyway. When she stepped into the gym, the laughter wasn't loud, but it rippled through the group like a wave. No one pointed. No one addressed her directly. They just whispered in corners and laughed without looking at her. The gym teacher barked out orders, pretending not to notice. During warm-ups, she tripped on the edge of the mat. Her partner for the day, a girl named Lizette, offered no hand. Instead, she stood nearby and muttered something under her breath, her voice low but intentional. Taylor didn't ask what she said. She got up, brushed off her knees, and completed the exercises in silence. When they were dismissed, she went back to her locker and found that her sneakers had been soaked in water and placed in the freezer. Her socks were missing. She wore her wet shoes back to class, the chill clinging to her toes like frost. That afternoon, she visited the library, thinking she could find refuge between the aisles of history and fiction. The moment she entered, the lights above the aisle she stepped into began to flicker. Not a power outage, just a row. She moved to the next, and the flickering stopped. Back to the original aisle, and it started again. She stared up at the buzzing fluorescent bulbs for a moment, then kept moving. As she reached for a book on cultural anthropology, she noticed a slip of paper wedged between the pages. Someone had written in pencil, "Too smart to be safe." She closed the book without checking it out and returned to her desk. In art class, she was assigned to paint a self-portrait. She worked slowly, carefully blending the tones, building the shadows, trying to capture the curve of her jaw, the texture of her hair. When she returned from washing her brushes, she found someone had added thick black slashes across the canvas. Her image was disfigured, the eyes painted over in gray. The teacher said nothing, just offered her a new canvas and told her to start over. That night, she tossed the original into the trash without a word. Friday morning brought more rain. Her umbrella had snapped on the way to the bus stop, and her socks were damp by the time she entered the building. Her locker wouldn't open. She tried the combination twice, then again. Finally, a custodian came with a toolkit. The lock had been jammed with chewing gum and pencil lead. Once it was pried open, her books were missing, replaced by balled-up napkins and a crumpled test from another student, someone named Carter, who had scored a perfect grade. The custodian didn't comment, just nodded and walked away. At lunch, her usual spot near the back wall had been taken by a group of students who looked directly at her and didn't move. She stood still for a moment, tray in hand, then turned and sat at a different table, the one nearest the trash bins. The seat wobbled. The smell clung to her food. She didn't eat. When she got up, she realized her tray had been marked with mustard in the shape of a question mark. It hadn't been there when she sat down. That evening, she didn't tell her mother about any of it. Instead, she said she was tired. Her mother nodded and told her to rest. In her room, Taylor changed into dry clothes and stared at the wall for a long time. She opened her notebook and wrote down the words from the book slip. "Too smart to be safe." Her picture, the same unflattering one from the bulletin board, filled the screen. A robotic voice announced her as the newest academic asset of Eldridge Academy, then stumbled through facts she had never provided. It listed her GPA as inflated, mentioned achievements she hadn't earned, and falsely stated she was the daughter of a famous civil rights attorney. Then the screen glitched and cut to bloopers from the drama club. And just like that, it ended. Students laughed. Some clapped sarcastically. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just sat there, hands folded tightly in her lap, while the teacher adjusted the projector and told the class to settle down. At lunch, more followed. Her tray contained a folded paper napkin shaped like a crown, placed neatly next to her sandwich. Around her, students tapped their utensils rhythmically on their trays in unison as she passed. Not loud, not fast, but eerily synchronized. Top, paisa, top. She ignored it, sat near the exit, and ate one bite of bread before wrapping the rest back in plastic. That afternoon, her English teacher handed out printed essays. Taylor hadn't written anything extraordinary, just a straightforward analysis of the poem they'd been assigned. Yet her paper had a single red stamp across the top, unoriginal content. When she approached the teacher privately after class to explain that the essay was her own, the teacher simply raised a brow and replied that the phrasing seemed suspiciously advanced. She was told to rewrite it and handed a sample outline labeled, "For struggling writers." Later that week, the school held its annual Spirit Assembly. Students filed into the gym in uniform clusters, cheer squad in matching windbreakers, athletes in team jerseys, debate club with clipboards and ribbons. Taylor entered quietly, unsure where to sit. Before she could find a place, a girl in a bright gold blazer stepped onto the bleachers holding a clipboard. She called out, asking for any students not yet assigned a group to come forward. 5 names were read. Taylor's was last. The others were new exchange students, quiet, confused. They were led to the center of the gym floor and asked to hold signs for a welcome to Eldridge performance. The signs were covered until the moment they were asked to flip them over. The audience clapped as the music began, and the students lifted the signs in sequence. Taylor's sign, unlike the others, didn't say welcome. It said warning. The applause slowed. A few gasped. Most laughed. Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't drop the sign. She held it in place until the coordinator rushed forward and pulled it from her hands, whispering that there had been a mistake. The gym echoed with muffled chuckles for the rest of the assembly. The following day, during our class, the students were told to sculpt something that represented how they saw themselves. Taylor worked carefully, shaping a small figure curled into itself, modest, smooth, without details. She placed it on the drying shelf with the others. By the next morning, her sculpture had been replaced with a crude caricature. Dark clay, oversized lips, slanted eyes, hair scratched into uneven strands. It had been placed on her desk before she arrived. When she saw it, the room seemed to spin for a moment. No one claimed responsibility. The teacher made no comment, only cleared it away and suggested she try again. She declined. Friday brought the final blow of the week. The school hosted a mandatory team-building retreat, a half-day of workshops and trust exercises. Students were divided into groups and instructed to participate in a scavenger hunt across the school grounds. Each team received a list of clues that required collaboration and communication. Taylor's team included 3 seniors she didn't know and 1 sophomore who never looked up from his phone. They barely spoke to her. At the first station, when the clue required forming pairs, she was left alone. At the second, she arrived to find the clue card already filled out, incorrectly. At the third, the team left her behind entirely. When she finally made her way to the last station, out of breath, she was met with confused glances. One instructor asked where the others were. She didn't answer. She simply took the blank form, filled it in herself, and handed it back. At the end of the event, awards were given for enthusiasm, creativity, leadership. Taylor's name was not mentioned, but as students filed out of the auditorium, a slip of paper fell from her folder. She hadn't put it there. It was folded in quarters, pale yellow. Inside, a single typed sentence, "You are the project. The school is watching." That night, at home, she didn't eat. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched plate while her mother hummed softly at the stove. Her mother didn't press. She had begun to notice the silence thickening each day her daughter returned home. Instead of questions, she simply rested a hand on Taylor's shoulder, warm and wordless. She obeyed the unwritten code by shrinking into the spaces they left for her, because resistance, at this stage, would only feed the fire. She had not yet learned how to fight it. On Monday morning, she found her locker door slightly ajar. She always double-checked the lock, always turned the dial 3 full rotations after closing it, yet there it stood, barely open, swaying slightly from a draft. Her gut twisted. She opened it the rest of the way and stepped back immediately. Inside, slumped against the back wall, was a mannequin. It wore her clothes, her extra sweater, her spare shoes, even a handmade bracelet she thought she had lost. The face was blank, smooth plastic, but its head had been painted brown and its features drawn on crudely with black marker. Exaggerated lips, wide eyes, thick brows. The image was grotesque, but worse than that was the posture. The figure had been positioned hunched forward, arms limp, legs twisted inward. It looked not just foolish, but broken. Above its head, taped to the locker wall, was a single note, "Now you can take a day off." Taylor's breath caught in her chest, and for a second, her knees weakened. But no tears came. She simply closed the locker slowly, turned, and walked away. She didn't go to the office. She didn't report it. What would be the point? She already knew what they would say. Some student prank, a misunderstanding, no evidence. She had heard it before. Instead, she walked to the restroom and locked herself in a stall. There, with her forehead resting against the cool door, she counted slowly to 100. She needed her heart to slow down. She needed her legs to stay steady. She needed to make it through the day. In second period, she sat at her desk and opened her textbook. But her mind drifted not to what had happened, but to how precise it had all become. Every insult, every prank, every setup, it wasn't random anymore. It was coordinated. It had evolved from simple cruelty to something far more disturbing: the systematic dismantling of her identity. In fourth period, her name was removed from the attendance sheet. When the teacher called out the roll, she paused at the blank line and frowned. "Who's missing?" she asked aloud. Taylor raised her hand slowly, unsure if it was a test. The teacher blinked at her and said nothing, simply scribbled something on her clipboard and moved on. Later that day, in computer lab, her assigned station wouldn't log in. The screen displayed an error message: user profile not found. While other students typed away, she sat staring at her frozen reflection in the darkened monitor, wondering if this was the point: to erase her completely, not just from their social circles, but from the records themselves. During dismissal, the announcements played over the intercom as usual, listing club meetings and reminders. But today, there was a new addition: a lost and found item. A personality has been located in the front office, apparently unclaimed. Students, please check if it's yours. Laughter followed, quiet, restrained, but unmistakable. No names were used, but everyone turned their heads toward her as they filed out. The next day, in the hallway outside the music room, someone had arranged a row of mannequins along the wall, dressed in different outfits, each tagged with name tags bearing real student names. One mannequin wore another copy of Taylor's uniform, but instead of her name, the tag simply said placeholder. It stood with its head down, arms hanging loose, a paper crown taped to its head. The message was clear. She wasn't one of them. She was a stand-in, a shadow, a caricature they could toy with. Someone brushed past her and muttered, "It's getting lifelike." The mannequins were removed before the period ended. The staff claimed they were art props. No one investigated. In seventh period, her science lab notebook had been replaced with a stack of blank pages. Her name had been scribbled out and rewritten with a slur. She quietly borrowed paper from another student who didn't speak to her, took notes, and said nothing. That night, while walking home, she passed the art room and saw the light still on. She stepped closer and peeked through the glass. Inside, a group of students stood around a table sculpting with clay. On the center of the table stood another mannequin head, this one painted to look like her. It had her hairstyle, her glasses, her skin tone, but instead of a neutral face, it wore a permanent frozen smirk. One student reached out and smeared black paint across the mouth, like a gag. She backed away from the door before they could see her. At home, her mother noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the deeper shadows under her eyes, but didn't press. She simply asked if anyone had been kind today. Taylor said no. Her mother wrapped her in a long, silent hug and kissed the top of her head. That night, Taylor wrote nothing in her journal. Instead, she stared at the mannequin's face in her memory, the smirk, the painted gag, and something inside her shifted. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. They weren't just trying to make her miserable. They were trying to define her, to sculpt their version of who she was and display it publicly. And all the while, they kept her silent, expecting her to keep shrinking. As she left the house and stepped into the pale morning light, she didn't look up. She simply moved forward with a practiced rhythm, her footsteps quiet, precise, uninviting. At school, she noticed the change immediately. At the entrance, a clipboard had been posted with updated homeroom assignments. Her name was missing. She stared at the list for a full minute, checked it 3 times, then walked to the office where a new secretary glanced at her with forced politeness. After a moment of typing and squinting at the screen, the woman told her that her file was marked for reassignment and handed her a printed slip directing her to a new room in the basement annex, the oldest section of the school, mostly unused and known for housing detention overflow and storage. Her new homeroom smelled of mildew and chalk dust, the windows stained with years of neglect. Only 5 desks were arranged inside, 3 of them already occupied by students who looked as displaced and disregarded as she felt. The teacher, a tired man with heavy eyelids and a loosely knotted tie, barely acknowledged her entrance. He motioned to an empty seat and resumed taking attendance from a list she wasn't on. When she raised her hand to mention it, he waved her off and said, "It'll catch up in the system eventually." That phrase repeated itself throughout the day. At the registrar's desk, when she asked why her ID badge no longer granted her library access, the woman behind the counter typed in her student number and frowned before offering the same sentence. At the cafeteria, when her lunch code returned an error and she stood there with a tray cooling in her hands, the cashier, a kind older man who had previously smiled at her every day, now just offered a confused look and told her, "Not found in the meal plan directory. Sorry, sweetheart. Might be a system thing." In her 3rd period literature class, she discovered her name had been removed from the peer workshop schedule. When students were paired for review, she sat alone, watching the others pass papers back and forth while the teacher offered no correction, only moving on to the next group as if her desk didn't exist. She looked down at her own essay, a carefully written reflection on the theme of duality, and quietly slid it back into her folder. In biology, she raised her hand to clarify an assignment instruction. The teacher paused, looked around, and then selected another student who hadn't even raised a hand. After class, when Taylor approached her to ask about the missed lab credit from last week, the woman flipped through her gradebook, furrowed her brow, and said, "There's no mark for you at all. You sure you're in this section?" By lunchtime, it became clear that something had changed behind the scenes. Not just the students, but the systems, the school records, the digital logs, the class databases. It was as if a quiet hand had been sweeping through the school's infrastructure, deleting her one line at a time. But whoever was doing it wasn't sloppy. They didn't remove her name entirely, just enough to make her presence questionable, just enough to make her existence at Eldridge feel like a bureaucratic error. And that ambiguity made it harder to fight. The staff couldn't defend her because they didn't see her. The students didn't speak her name because they didn't have to. She became not just unwanted, but undocumented. That afternoon, she returned to her locker and found it emptied again. Her books were gone. In their place was a stack of pre-filled permission forms, field trip waivers, parent contact slips, and academic probation notices, all signed with her name in a handwriting that mimicked hers almost exactly. Her mother hadn't signed any of them, and none had been submitted through her. At the bottom of the stack was a form addressed to the guidance counselor, requesting removal from advanced placement courses due to overwhelm and social integration issues. She stared at the line, requesting withdrawal from honors literature. Her chest burned. She crumpled the paper, but didn't throw it away. Instead, she folded it and tucked it into the small inside pocket of her backpack, the one she reserved for things that mattered. She marched straight to the guidance office, clutching the paper tightly. The woman who greeted her was new. Her badge read Ms. Delaney, Support Services. Taylor explained the situation, showed the forged form, and asked how such a request could have been processed without her or her parents' consent. Ms. Delaney scanned her screen, frowned, and then offered a soft, polite smile. "I'm not showing any records of you in honors courses. Are you sure you've been attending the right classes?" That moment sealed something for Taylor. It wasn't just the students anymore. It wasn't just pranks and whispers and notes. The school itself had turned against her. The systems were becoming part of the cruelty. And the worst part was that no one questioned it. They accepted the erasure because it was subtle, bureaucratic, clean. The cruelty now wore a uniform and carried a clipboard. It smiled while it erased her. On the way home, she sat at the back of the bus, her head pressed against the cool glass, watching the city blur past in streaks of brown and gray. Her phone buzzed with a notification from the school portal. She no longer had access to the parent-teacher dashboard. Her mother's email was marked as invalid. She stared at the screen for a long time, then powered the device off and placed it in her coat pocket. That evening, she pulled every piece of paper she had collected, the notes, the mock assignments, the fake forms, and arranged them across her desk like a puzzle. Each one was a clue, not to who, but to how. She didn't care who was doing it anymore. She wanted to understand the structure behind it, the architecture of this campaign, because someone had to be maintaining it. Someone had to be feeding the system these changes. It wasn't random. It was controlled, measured, precise. At dinner, her mother asked her how classes were going. Taylor responded that there had been a scheduling mix-up and she was being reassigned to new teachers. Her mother, exhausted from work and trusting of authority, nodded sympathetically and offered to email the school in the morning. Taylor didn't stop her, but she knew already that email would bounce back. By Tuesday, it was clear that whatever force had set itself against her was no longer content with removing her name from rosters and forms. Now it wanted to tear away whatever dignity she had left, piece by piece, in full view. It began with a lab apron. In chemistry class, where uniforms were required, every student was issued a clean, school-labeled apron. Hers, set neatly on her chair, smelled sharply of bleach. At first, she assumed it was from overcleaning, but when she put it on, her skin prickled. The fabric had been coated with something sticky, something that soaked through her shirt and clung to her skin like oil. Her lab partner, a girl who rarely made eye contact, shifted her chair farther away as if the smell repulsed her. The teacher didn't comment, only reminded everyone to follow safety protocol and complete the experiment without distractions. Taylor said nothing. After class, she walked to the restroom and scrubbed her arms until her skin turned red, but the residue stayed stubborn and slick. That same day, someone had slipped a flyer into her locker, folded once, printed in ink that had smudged in places. It was a parody of the student newspaper's advice column. The headline read, "How to Fade, Tips for the Unseen," and beneath it a list of steps. Walk softer, speak less, smile only when asked, accept that not every space needs you. At the bottom, in smaller text, if no one asks you to leave, it doesn't mean they want you to stay. She tore it in half and shoved the pieces into her backpack. Not because she didn't want anyone to see it, but because she couldn't bear the idea of someone thinking she took the message seriously. By midweek, her assigned seat in the library had been moved. When she approached her usual corral, she found her name replaced with a sticker that read sanitation only. The librarian, when asked, responded that students weren't assigned permanent spots and that she was free to sit anywhere else, except, it seemed, the 3 rows nearest the window, which had suddenly been labeled, reserved for committee fellows. Every time she opened her laptop to begin work, the Wi-Fi disconnected. Her access code, once valid, had been revoked. The IT desk said it must have expired. She would need to reapply through her homeroom teacher, someone who now responded to her emails with auto-generated replies. In gym, the usual indifference turned sharper. During a relay race, she was the last pick for a team, and when it was her turn to run, her shoelaces were already untied. She hadn't touched them since changing. As she ran, one shoe flew off, and she slipped, falling hard on the gym floor. The class erupted in polite laughter, measured and restrained, the kind that wouldn't provoke disciplinary action, but loud enough to sting. No one helped her up. She pushed herself off the floor slowly, not to stall for sympathy, but to force her body to keep moving under control. She finished the lap barefoot and bleeding slightly. The locker room offered no refuge. That afternoon, someone replaced her gym towel with a thinner, worn-out one stained faint yellow. It smelled like mildew. She used it anyway. When she returned to her locker, she found a sticky note on the mirror tucked inside. It read, "Not even glass wants to reflect you." She took it down without a word and placed it in the pocket with the others. Her collection of evidence had grown, a quiet archive of small brutalities no one would ever believe unless they lived through them. The degradation reached its crescendo on Thursday morning. As part of Spirit Week, students were encouraged to dress in themed colors. That day's theme was heritage and roots. Most students wore flags as capes, cultural patterns printed on hoodies, and ancestral colors in accessories. Taylor wore a simple head wrap, deep maroon, paired with a gold pin passed down from her grandmother. The moment she stepped into the building, the silence around her changed. It wasn't the usual indifference. It was focused, calculated. During third period, Her history teacher stopped mid-lecture, looked at her, and asked if she was wearing headgear as a political statement. Taylor froze, said no, and was told to remove it to avoid distracting others. She hesitated, slowly unwinding the cloth. She felt her scalp burn, not from shame, but from the way 30 pairs of eyes pretended not to watch her. She folded the wrap carefully and placed it in her bag. The teacher resumed the lesson without missing a beat. At lunch, her tray held nothing but a single sandwich sealed in tight plastic. Her normal vegetarian option wasn't available. When she asked for the alternate, the server responded that her dietary restriction had been removed from the system. She sat in silence, eating slowly, chewing each bite as if it were a task. Students around her wore painted faces, danced in circles, cheered for each other's colors. No one cheered for hers. At the end of a lunch period, someone slipped behind her, tapped her shoulder, and whispered, "That color doesn't suit this school." By the time she turned around, they were gone. That evening, her mother noticed the absence of appetite, the slow, mechanical movements, and asked what was wrong. Taylor said she was just tired. Her mother pressed her hands together, but didn't argue. She only said, "You're allowed to speak, you know." Taylor didn't respond. She climbed the stairs and closed the door behind her, then sat at her desk and stared at her reflection in the darkened screen of her laptop. She took the gold pin from her bag and turned it in her fingers, the metal cool against her skin. Her grandmother had worn it during church services and family reunions. It had survived decades, migrations, hardship. It felt heavier now. She moved through her morning routine deliberately, every motion chosen. She dressed not in the school's required uniform blazer, but in a simple fitted jacket that carried no crest, no badge, no label. Her walk to school was quiet, and the school itself buzzed with the usual chaos of Friday freedom. But to her, the noise was muffled, distant. The difference was not outside. It was inside. Something had shifted. She didn't feel large or brave or suddenly immune. She just no longer felt small. The administrative office was the first stop. She requested a printout of her grades and class schedule. The secretary hesitated, asked for her name, and paused as she typed it into the system. The screen flickered, then went blank. The woman frowned and asked her to wait. Taylor said nothing. The silence stretched. The principal emerged from the hallway and approached, smiling tightly. "We're just doing some system updates today. Nothing to worry about." Taylor didn't blink. She thanked them both and left without another word. In her backpack was a file, an inch thick, compiled over weeks. Every note, every fake form, every altered assignment, and every name she had quietly recorded along the way. Her silence had not been surrender. It had been observation. At lunch, she sat at her usual spot by the bin wall. The taunts were quieter now, not because they had stopped, but because her reaction never came. Cruelty had grown bored with itself, but a test always came before a shift. That day, in gym, a new unit began, self-defense awareness. A guest instructor had been brought in, a man in his 40s with a calm voice and steady hands. Students whispered about it all week, jokes about kicking each other, pretending to faint, trying to make fools of the demonstration. When the coach called for volunteers, everyone hesitated. Then one hand went up. Cameron Pierce, a senior football player with a wide grin and a reputation for pushing limits, stepped forward. He glanced toward Taylor as he moved, grinning wider, and said he wanted to test the expert's skill. The instructor nodded and walked him through a basic maneuver, how to break a wrist grab. "Now," the man said, "who wants to try with a partner?" Students laughed and stepped back. A few pretended to stretch. The coach looked around. "Miss Monroe," he said calmly, "would you mind helping demonstrate?" Her stomach coiled, but she stepped forward. Cameron raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Sure," he said too cheerfully. "Let's see what happens." He reached for her wrist, too fast, too hard. It was more than a grab. It was a challenge, a dare, an attempt to assert control. For 6 weeks, they had erased her from rosters, broken her name in whispers, twisted her face into dolls and jokes. And now he thought he could do the same with her body. The instant his fingers closed around her wrist, something in her snapped into clarity. Not rage, not even fear, just truth. She pivoted her body and dropped her weight the way she'd been taught years before in a different world, under different circumstances. Her wrist twisted free, and before he could recover, her hand pressed against the center of his chest, and he dropped, stumbled, not hurt, but visibly shaken. The gym fell silent. No one clapped. No one laughed. For the first time in weeks, every eye was on her, and none of them were amused. The instructor nodded once, impressed. "Nicely done," he said, but the words felt distant. Taylor stepped back, her expression neutral. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply returned to her place and waited for the lesson to continue. But the silence lingered. The shift wasn't in what had happened, but in how it was received. For the first time, they saw something they hadn't expected. Not anger, not a burst of temper. They saw calm, control, power. She had taken the blow meant for her spirit and redirected it, turned the moment into a mirror they hadn't intended to look into. In the locker room, the air felt different. No one touched her things. No one whispered. Even the girl 2 rows down, who had once dyed Taylor's towel, now watched her like someone re-evaluating a problem she thought she'd already solved. In the hallway, heads turned, but not with smirks. With calculation. She wasn't just the girl who never fought back. Now she was the girl they hadn't fully understood. Her silence had depth. Her calm had roots. By the end of the day, her name reappeared on the library roster. Her email access was restored. Her digital grade book, once empty, showed updates. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. But it was fear, quiet and quick. Someone behind a screen realized she had been watching. And now she had moved. The system, built to suffocate, had shifted just slightly under the weight of her stillness, turning to stone. After school, she didn't take the bus. She walked. Her feet moved without direction, her body aware of every step. She thought about the moment in the gym, the feel of control, the weightlessness of moving on her terms. It wasn't about violence. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming space. For the first time, her silence hadn't been used against her. It had become her power. That night, she sat at her desk, file open, hand steady. She didn't burn the notes. She didn't throw anything away. She organized it all more carefully, added dates, created timeline. Because power wasn't just in the moment, it was in the preparation. She wrote a letter to the school board. She didn't mention names yet. She listed incidents, attached scans. She signed it without anger, without flourish. Just her name, her real name. Then, as more students told the story and tried to strip it down to the facts, they discovered there was no real exaggeration needed. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't fought. She had simply acted. With purpose. With control. With skill. The truth held more weight than any version they tried to retell. Taylor didn't change her routine. She still arrived early. She still walked the halls with her shoulders back and her eyes focused. But something in the way she moved said she was no longer holding back for fear of being erased. She was holding still because she had power in reserve. She was no longer seen as the target. She was becoming something else, unreadable, unshakable, and dangerously calm. The administration's posture shifted just as subtly. Her class placements, once lost or altered, had been corrected. Her advanced placement credits were reinstated. Teachers who once looked through her now met her eyes and spoke her name clearly when calling on her in class. It wasn't respect yet. It was uncertainty. The kind that comes when a structure built on confidence begins to doubt its own foundation. But even as order reassembled around her, the pressure hadn't stopped. It only evolved. They didn't confront her. They didn't repeat the pranks. But they watched. Students watched her from doorways. Teachers glanced at her with calculation. She wasn't in danger anymore, not of the same humiliations. But now she was being studied like a puzzle. How had she changed so suddenly? Who had taught her? Was she angry? Would she retaliate? These questions hung in the air like smoke. On Tuesday, Cameron didn't show up for gym. He hadn't spoken since the demonstration. Not to her. not about her. Rumors said he was embarrassed. Some said he had been scolded by the administration. Others suggested he was hiding from the fallout. Taylor didn't seek him out. She didn't need to. Her moment with him hadn't been about him. It had been about her. What changed now wasn't a victory over him, but a reclaiming of herself. That afternoon, the art teacher pulled her aside and quietly returned the disfigured sculpture from weeks before, now restored and altered. The smirk had been removed, the mouth neutral, the features softened. The teacher said nothing, just held it out to her and let her choose what to do with it. Taylor took it without expression and placed it in her bag. She wouldn't forget. The hallway bulletin board, which had once displayed her mocked photo and taunting captions, now held a list of students nominated for the leadership seminar. Her name was listed near the bottom. No fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet placement, as if the school were trying to rewrite history without admitting fault. She understood it wasn't a reward. It was an attempt to co-opt her, to bring her into the system that had tried so hard to erase her. She didn't tear the notice down. She didn't decline the invitation. She accepted it. Because sometimes the best resistance is to stand exactly where they once denied you. In the seminar room that Thursday, she sat at the far end of the table. The other nominees, mostly student council members and academic award winners, kept their distance at first. But when discussion began and the facilitator asked for ideas on inclusion and student representation, all eyes turned toward her, not with welcome, with expectation. She didn't respond. Not yet. She let the silence build until it became uncomfortable. Then she asked a simple question. How do you protect someone from being removed without anyone noticing? No one answered. The facilitator blinked, scribbled a note, and moved on. But her words lingered. The room's atmosphere had changed. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She had simply spoken a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. The next day, she submitted her portfolio to the student newspaper, an anonymous piece titled Ghost Records. It documented changes in school systems, the invisibility of cruelty through formal process, and the way silence is often forced, not chosen. It did not include names. It did not call anyone out. But every student who read it knew exactly who had written it. The piece was published online without fanfare, but by the next morning, it had been printed and posted across lockers, bathroom stalls, and hallway walls. It spread like fire in silence. No one claimed responsibility for the copies. Teachers tried to remove them. Students kept replacing them. Her words had struck something deep, not just in the targets of cruelty, but in those who had stood by and watched. She received no official praise, no apology, but things continued to shift. She was no longer tripped in gym. No one messed with her locker. The mannequins were removed from the art room completely. And yet, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt responsible, because now eyes were on her not to mock her, but to judge what she would do with the power she had reclaimed. In the cafeteria, she ate quietly. A few students began sitting nearer to her, not close, but not avoiding her either. The air between them was cautious, but no longer poisoned. She didn't initiate. She didn't chase acceptance. She simply remained, and they adjusted around her. And no one dared speak her name aloud unless they meant it with clarity. The shift had occurred so gradually it felt like erosion, not explosion. But the cracks in the walls were spreading faster now, and those who had once stood above it all were beginning to feel the ground shift beneath them. It began with a question raised during the morning faculty meeting, one that had no easy answer. Who had approved the false documents that almost removed Taylor from the honors program? The question wasn't asked by her. It was asked by MS. Corbin, a newly hired administrator who had read the Ghost Records piece and had spent the weekend cross-checking systems. She didn't say the name of the student, but the timing and the evidence were unmistakable. Teachers exchanged glances. Some frowned, some shrugged. The principal, Mr. Winstead, dismissed the matter as an internal clerical mix-up, but the mood in the room had already changed. When trust in the system begins to decay, everyone starts searching for someone to blame. Later that day, Mr. Denning, the IT manager, received an anonymous email containing screenshots of tampered gradebooks, timestamps of login activity tied to specific faculty IDs, and internal communications that revealed someone had indeed approved the changes manually. The email wasn't signed, but the evidence was irrefutable. The administration attempted to suppress the leak, but within hours, copies of the files were circulating among student leaders and PTA members. Suddenly, Taylor's experience could no longer be labeled as anecdotal. It was now documented, and documentation, unlike rumors, could not be silenced with a smile. Students who had once mocked her began to grow quiet not out of fear of retribution, but from recognition. The narrative had flipped. Taylor was no longer the outsider trying to fit into a world that resisted her. She was the one holding up a mirror, and the reflections were ugly. Cameron Pierce returned to school but refused to meet her gaze. He didn't speak during gym, didn't take the lead in drills, didn't hover around the locker room with his usual entourage. One afternoon, he found her in the library, standing beside the reference section. He stood still, silent, and after a moment, he placed a folded note on the table between them. Then he walked away. She didn't pick it up. She left it untouched because closure on his terms meant nothing. That week, disciplinary hearings were called for 4 faculty members and 2 senior students, Lizette among them. The students weren't suspended, not immediately, but they were removed from club leadership and barred from participating in upcoming school events. The announcement came quietly, buried in the Friday bulletin, but the hallway response was seismic. Lizette's friends stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, uncertain whether to console her or distance themselves. She had never been publicly confronted before, and now the silence around her had the same weight Taylor once carried. When they passed each other near the lockers, Lizette opened her mouth as if to speak, but Taylor walked on. She didn't need apologies. The damage had been done, and recognition of guilt was not restoration. In the teacher's lounge, murmurs turned into arguments. Some demanded answers. Others sought distance. The art teacher, shaken by her role in the early mockery, resigned quietly. The librarian issued a formal apology to the student body in an email, citing a failure to uphold the inclusive values the school claimed to represent. For the first time, the institution acknowledged, without naming her directly, that something had gone deeply wrong. Yet no one used the word racism. Not in print, not aloud. It was dressed in phrases like policy failure, overlooked oversight, and miscommunication. Still, the meaning was unmistakable. The head of the PTA, a woman named Mrs. Eldon, requested a student town hall. Taylor was invited to attend, not as a speaker, but as an observer. When she arrived, she found a seat near the back and listened. Students stood and described moments they had ignored, laughed at, or pretended not to notice. One sophomore admitted she had seen the locker mannequin and said nothing. Another student from the debate team recounted how jokes were passed during lunch that he now realized had reinforced the culture of silence. Taylor remained quiet throughout, her expression unreadable, her eyes watchful. What they were doing wasn't confession. It was survival. People were trying to extract themselves from the damage without owning their roles. But she listened, because listening was part of her power now. At the end of the town hall, someone asked her to speak. She declined. Instead, she stood, nodded once, and left. Her absence in that moment was louder than any speech. She would not be used as proof of the school's recovery. She had been the wound. She would not also be the bandage. Outside, beneath the wide sky, she paused at the steps. The air smelled like rain, and the wind brushed against her collar. Her body still held the echo of tension, the muscle memory of bracing for attack, but it no longer dictated her movements. She walked home slowly, allowing herself to feel the shift. Not peace, not relief, but the kind of quiet that follows a storm when the world has changed shape and everything familiar now carries a new weight. That evening, she placed the note Cameron had left into her box without opening it. She didn't need to read apologies written in haste. Instead, she opened her journal and began to write, not a list, not a timeline, but a declaration. She wrote that she had survived not because she was invisible, but because she had learned how to be seen on her own terms. She wrote that systems, like people, could lie with smiles and erase with signatures. By the time the semester neared its close, the school no longer felt like the fortress it once was. Eldridge Academy's stone walls still stood tall, its banners still waved in the spring wind, and the students still filled its halls each morning. But something vital had shifted beneath the polished surface. The machinery of quiet cruelty that once operated in perfect silence had stalled, its cogs exposed and forced into stillness by one girl's refusal to vanish. Taylor Monroe moved through the final weeks not as a victor, not as a martyr, but as a witness to the slow unraveling of a system built to exclude while pretending to embrace. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't rallied crowds or held signs or forced confrontation in public spaces. Instead, she had endured, absorbed, and waited. And when the time came, she revealed the truth not with drama, but with precision. And now, those who once orchestrated the spectacle had to live in the silence, left behind by their own theater. Lizette stopped attending classes regularly. She came in late and left early. Her posture had changed, the sharp angles of her arrogance softening into uncertainty. The tight circle of friends who once moved around her like moons orbiting a planet had drifted away, leaving her to navigate the school alone for the first time. It wasn't that she had been exiled. It was that the illusion of her invincibility had been punctured. She attempted on 2 occasions to speak to Taylor, both times stopping short before words reached her lips. The look on her face was not just guilt, it was confusion. She had built her identity on being unchallenged, and now, confronted with the mirror of her own actions, she didn't recognize herself. She had mocked a stranger and tried to erase a person. Now she stood where Taylor once stood, not as a victim, but as someone whose reputation had become too loud to ignore. Cameron no longer laughed in the halls. His voice, once the loudest during assemblies, had taken on a quieter tone. He helped clean up after gym, stayed behind in classrooms to reset chairs, and stopped interrupting during discussions. There was no announcement, no speech of redemption, just small changes in behavior that, while not erasing what he had done, suggested that perhaps the lesson had taken root. Whether from shame, reflection, or both, the arrogance had begun to fall away. He never asked for forgiveness, and Taylor never offered it. Some wrongs were not meant to be forgotten or smoothed over with kind words. They were meant to remain, not as wounds, but as reminders. The school board introduced new policies, ones aimed at transparency, equity, accountability. Anonymous reporting channels were created. Class records were protected by layered access. Student representation was expanded on internal committees. These weren't sweeping transformations, but they marked the beginning of change. Not because the institution had suddenly become just, but because it had been forced to recognize its own failings. The administrators, who once looked past her, now nodded when they saw her. And though no one openly admitted to what had been done, the very act of acknowledgement was a step forward. It was imperfect, but it was something. Taylor herself did not change overnight. She still preferred the corners of rooms, still kept her voice low when speaking, still carried herself with the calm she had cultivated from necessity. But she now understood the value of her presence. She no longer shrank into the silence others imposed on her. Instead, she shaped that silence into space, room for her to grow on her own terms. She joined the school's literary journal not to publish stories about what had happened, but to create space for others whose voices trembled under pressure. She mentored younger students, especially the ones who lingered at the edge of groups, who walked a little slower, who sat alone in the cafeteria with eyes fixed on their trays. She didn't tell them what to do. She didn't preach. She simply sat beside them, because sometimes presence was the most radical act of all. Her file, the one she had compiled so carefully, piece by piece, document by document, remained in her desk drawer. She didn't destroy it. She didn't submit it to news outlets or upload it to forums. She kept it as a testament, not to vengeance, but to vigilance. She knew what it meant to be silenced, and she knew that systems didn't break easily. They repaired themselves when no one watched. So she watched, quietly, consistently. That was her form of resistance. Not flame, but steady light. Graduation approached, and with it came recognition ceremonies, student speeches, and year-end awards. Taylor was nominated for a scholarship honoring perseverance. She declined, not because she didn't deserve it, but because she wanted them to stop framing her survival as inspiration. Her existence should never have been tested in the first place. She asked that the award go to a student who had overcome personal illness and worked behind the scenes to support others without recognition. Her request was honored. On the last day of school, the hallway was lined with yearbooks and scribbled messages, lockers slamming one final time before summer swallowed them all into different directions. Taylor stood at her locker, her bag already packed, her books returned. She opened the small compartment one final time and stared at the empty space where once a mannequin had been slumped, painted with mockery. Now it held only her name tag, neatly peeled from the bulletin board by someone unknown, and slipped gently into her locker. It read her name, just her name. No sticker, no joke, no edit. She turned, walked down the hallway, and stepped out into the sunlight. The breeze lifted the edges of her jacket as she descended the steps, each one steady. She didn't look back, not because she wanted to forget, but because she had finally been seen as herself. Not a placeholder, not a warning, not a joke, but a person. Fully, quietly, unapologetically. The final lesson wasn't in her defense. It wasn't even in her resilience. It was in the truth that justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in fragments, in small admissions, in slow shifts, in changed behavior. And sometimes it is not something that is given, but something you become. The end. If you found this story powerful or moving, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'm curious, what part of the plot impacted you the most? Which character's transformation surprised you? Also, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Your thoughts shape how the next stories are told.